In this video, I'm going to show you how we can use Modem to create an alpha transparency mask for our objects that we can use in the Photoshop texturing process. So let's get going. As you can see, we have our little scene of our little crate here, and we have a UV map that's been created for our crate. Now, this process is absolutely critical that we have a UV map, so it's critical that you have one of these. So spend some time and make a good one. Okay, so what we want to do here is we want to make an alpha mask that follows this UV map exactly. So we're going to make an alpha mask, an alpha transparency channel for just this object. So that's why the UV map is critical. Now, in order to do this, we need to do a couple things before we can hit render. First things first, in your Lists tab, make sure your UV map is selected. I have mine selected here. It's called Crate. Now, let's jump over to the shader tree and expand your render options. Now, inside the render options, we have our frame settings. Now, this entire process is derived from the camera resolution because we're going to have a camera render a texture file that is 1024 by 1024. This number, make sure this number matches your texture file resolution over in Photoshop. That way, everything will line up correctly. Make DPI of 300, that's good. Pixel aspect ratio 1, we need to have that. So our camera settings are ready to go. The next thing we need to do is jump back up to our render tree, and let's look at our render outputs. Any scene that we create is going to default with two render outputs, the final color output and the alpha output. Well, we only want the alpha output because we want to create a transparency channel for our object. So we want to make sure that the alpha output, or the final color output is turned off. And you can do that either by deleting the render output, delete and choose that guy, or just by toggling the visibility right here with the little eye icon. Okay, so with our alpha channel output selected, our UV map selected, now we're ready to go. Let's go to the top of the screen where it says render, and we're going to choose bake to render outputs. Now when I click, watch what happens. It's going to bake an alpha channel for our selected UV map. So now we have an alpha channel that follows our object precisely. Important, we need to save it, so let's save this guy. I want to name mine alpha, or let's do it crate alpha. There we go. And I'm going to leave it as a target, and I want to save it right here on my desktop. Let's jump back over into Photoshop now and import that alpha channel that we just created. There's a couple ways you can do this, but I find the easiest way, since we know that each of our file sizes are exactly the same. This guy is 1024 by 1024, and the alpha output, or the alpha channel that we just created, is also 1024 by 1024. The easiest way to get both of these together, to combine them, is to go to the top of the screen where it says File and choose Place. Now let's navigate and find the file. There it is, Create Alpha, and hit Place. And if you notice, it placed it in the exact same location, centered, left, right, up, and down, and in our scene. Now, one of the kind of the quirks about working inside of Photoshop is whenever you make a transform or move or rotate it, you have to complete the transformation by clicking on this little checkbox right up here. There we go. All right, and here we go. Now, let's explore how we can use this alpha channel in our scene. Before we go too much further, I'm just going to turn the visibility off and show you what I've done. As you can see, I have my little red outlines are my UVs from Modo. I've started to add a little wood grain texture here, and I've also added a solid color in our background just to give it a little bit of visual separation from the different elements. Now, if you look really carefully, our wood grain texture is outside of the lines of our UVs, which isn't bad. That's okay, because anything outside the lines of our UVs is not going to show up inside of our 3D render. So it's okay to draw outside the line. But when we get into more complex objects, when we have multiple UV islands that are packed very, very closely together, having this much, kind of overlap can be a problem. So that's where our alpha channel comes in, because our alpha channel is going to toggle the visibility of all these pixels based off of the black and white image you see here. So we're going to use this black and white image to toggle the visibility of the pixels that we don't want to see. Okay, in order to do this, we're going to turn off all the other layers in our scene, so we're only seeing our alpha channel. Now go over to your Channels tab right here, Channels tab, and if you hold down the Command key on a Mac, Control key on a PC, notice how the cursor changes from a little to a little hand with a little dashed box. Once we click on the icon, and it has to be on the icon. Don't click over here on the text and don't click over here on the number. It has to be on the icon of the image itself. It's going to load that channel, as a selection. So now we can go back to our Layers tab, and I want to turn everything else back on. Now, all of my wood grain textures are in this folder, and we can mask folders. So that's what I'm going to do. I have my little diffuse folder selected, and you can see that the marching ants are on my screen, denoting we have pixels selected. So now, if I go down to the bottom of my Layers palette and click on the Layers Mask button, I'm going to mask out the contents of this entire folder with this image, which is pretty cool. Now, why I recommend doing it to a folder instead of to individual files is that any layer that we place in our folder, any file that we put in here, will also get masked because this is at the root of the folder. So we're masking at the folder level, not the individual layer level, which is pretty helpful. Okay, so we don't need this guy anymore, so we can just throw him away. And I'm going to save my scene. And there we go. So now we're using an alpha channel that we created from Modo, from our actual scene, to toggle the visibility of certain pixels inside of our Photoshop layer. I think you're really going to enjoy this workflow. It's going to be a huge, huge time saver and a file management tool.